It's really interesting to learn a little bit about how artifacts are made, and that will really help all of you in locating artifacts, because if you kind of know how they're made, then you kind of know a little bit better what to look for and where to look. So artifacts, first of all, they had to go and quarry what they were looking for. And I have different materials from point types that I found locally here that might be as far away as western New York or much further north up the East Coast. It's interesting that there was a lot of trade going on between the different tribes, as well as certain tribes that literally traveled by foot what would be a couple hundred miles or more to go to quarries and to chip large pieces of stone that they would then make into more reasonable sized pieces that they carry back with them, and then they would make many of their artifacts. However, they utilize a lot of localized stones. In fact, where I live, white quartz is by far the most common. I have literally hundreds of points made out of white quartz, as well as many tools. In fact, this point that I just showed you, I found this morning. I'm going to show you a few pages from two different books that will help you to get a better feel for how artifacts were made. First of all, we have an illustration here of men who are quarrying rock so that they can then make it into smaller sized pieces. So they use a large stone and they'd use it to knock off large, it's called nap off large pieces of stone, and then they would utilize that to make much smaller pieces. They would then use a hammerstone. Now this is a large hammerstone, but hammerstones were used, and they were used like this to hit the other stone and knock off different portions of the stone. As you can see here, this is percussion. It's called percussion technique of using a hammerstone, and you can see a piece flying off of there. But they also used other ways to nap off pieces, and this was the percussion, and there was either direct or indirect percussion, and they often would use a hammerstone or an antler billet or a wood billet to do this. And then not only did they use percussion, which is basically hitting it, they would also use pressure flaking, and you can see by holding it and applying pressure at specific areas, they could flick off little pieces of rock that they were making into a tool or to a point. So, for instance, you can see here there's the pressure flaked, and here's an example of a percussion worked artifact. This is where large flakes are taken off the point or the tool. Another one, you obviously can see this is pressure flaked. In fact, you almost need a microscope to actually see how small the different little flakes are that they've taken off of this point. When you're looking for artifacts, first of all, you probably either need to be looking where tribes either lived or where they hunted. And so what I like to do primarily is to look for campsites. They want to be near a water source, and they want to camp in an area that's relatively flat, whether that is at the top of a hill or whether it's more likely along a stream or a river. And in fact, a lot of the campsites that I've actually located are at confluences. Now, a confluence is where one or more streams come together. So if you have a larger river nearby where you live, and then you have smaller streams or even creeks that enter that river, and it's a flat area, that's often potentially a great place to look. When I look for artifacts, there's three basic ways to look for them. You can either do what's called surface finds, and that's largely by walking either fields, or I know out in the southwest and in Mexico, they actually walk some of the desert areas and just look for what they can find that has come to the top, normally through erosion or through rain, or a combination of them. Around here where I live, I find most of my artifacts in the spring after some of the fields have been plowed. So then I put on my rubber boots and I'll carry a stick, because you can actually dislodge a lot of artifacts that aren't fully visible, by poking them with a stick. So that's one way, surface finds, and along a confluence, or in what we would call flood zones. So one nice thing is, even though a lot of places where artifacts once were, they are now buried, so to speak, under people's front yards and things like that, a lot of the places where they would have camped continue to be in what are considered flood zones. So there's still possibly a way to look for them there. Another way is creek walking, and it's July as I'm doing this video, so this is what I would do this time of year. Creeks are usually the lowest, so I always walk upstream, because that way you're not muddying the water and potentially covering some artifacts you might have seen. And actually, as you go upstream, it's slightly elevated, so it's easier, I think, from that angle to see different artifacts. And I would say, by far, for me, I find more of the stone artifacts when I walk creeks. And then the third way is what's called excavation or digs. And obviously, you need permission to even walk somebody's field. So those are the ways to look for artifacts. So when I'm looking for artifacts in a field, what you want to do is walk the rows, and that means you don't want to trample a farmer's crops. So it actually makes it easier, then you don't get off course. You start in one row and you walk that row from one end of the field to the other, and depending on if the crop's really short still, then you can actually probably see several rows both direction, but then as it gets higher, you might only be able to see one row on either side. And actually, when a field is plowed, and before they harrow it and rake it, it's actually pretty hard to walk on, but that's when you see a lot of the artifacts and find them. So then what I usually do is I look for a fence post or a tree or some other landmark, the farmhouse, and try to stay in a grid pattern walking across the field, keeping glancing up, so otherwise you'll get way off course one way or the other, and you'll miss key areas of a field. I will say this, however, I have a expression that says you'll find 90% of the artifacts in 10% of the field. That's not always true, but that's often true, because obviously right where they camped may not be an entire field, but right where they camped is where you're going to find most of the artifacts. My name is Joel Fiscus, and I'm a treasure hunter.